Okay, so here is a narrated PowerPoint presentation about literary interpretation of the Decameron. And so what I want to do is just kind of start with some broad overview kind of interpretations, and then get more and more specific and tell you about some of the particular interpretations that scholars have come up with. I just researched and found some that I thought were relatively interesting, and I'll tell you about those and about some articles. Yes. Okay, so before I go to the next slide, a couple of things I wanted to emphasize. I want to re-emphasize what I said in the previous PowerPoint, that as you've read more, maybe you can see this more clearly, that the Decameron follows the stipulation that comedy should begin horribly and end pleasantly. And also, so talking generally about comedy, what else was I going to do? I was going to refer you to page 432, which is the beginning of the 10th story of day 5, page 432. There's actually some commentary on the nature of comedy and of what's funny. And so what it says is, let me see. Okay, here we go. So it's in the second paragraph of the 10th story on 432, where the narrator says, whether it is an accidental failing stemming from our debased morals, the narrator being Dioneo, not, I don't mean Boccaccio as narrator, but the narrator of this story is Dioneo. Anyway, he says, whether it is an accidental failing stemming from our debased morals or simply an innate attribute of men and women, I am unable to say, but the fact remains that we are more inclined to laugh at scandalous behavior than virtuous deeds, especially when we ourselves are not directly involved. So he's just making a brief comment on things that we're more likely to laugh at than others, scandalous deeds. Also, I thought it was interesting, the conclusion of day 5, after the stories are over of day 5, there's a brief sort of conclusion back to the frame of the storytellers. And so if you look at page 441 at the bottom and over onto page 442, the queen of the day asks Dioneo to sing a song, and he jokes around and names titles of funny songs of the period. As a reader, I don't recognize the humor in the titles for the most part. Some of them I can guess at. And so I think it just shows that comedy is synchronous. The comedy of another era or another culture sometimes doesn't make sense to us. So he mentions all these songs. He starts singing, Mona Aldruda, lift up your tail, for marvelous tidings I bring. It's the title of one of the songs. And they laugh and tell him to stop. He says, if I had a drum, I'd sing you skirts up, Mona Lapa, or the grass beneath the privet grows, or if you preferred, the waves of the sea are my torment. I'm not sure what's funny there, but if I lived in Italy in the 14th century, maybe I would get it. Anyway, if you look at that, there are more song titles. All right, slide 2, here we go. Just in general, some broad interpretations of the Decameron. It has some broad themes of intellect, fortune, and love. And so thinking about love here, looking at this dichotomy that I've sort of set up, and I didn't come up with this, it's been pointed out in many places, but there's a dichotomy in the entire Decameron, all 100 stories, between, on the one hand, profane love, and on the other hand, sacred or honorable love. And so the things that are associated with profane love are natural law, lust, the Renaissance, where profane love was becoming more acceptable, the stories of the Decameron and the characters in those stories, in those 100 stories, are associated with profane love. Profane love is associated with the new middle class that I talked about in the previous PowerPoint, and associated with the plague. On the other end of the spectrum is the sacred or honorable love, which is associated with honor and chivalry, which is associated with decorum, which is associated with the Middle Ages, which is associated with the storytellers, these 10 young folks who have left Florence to escape the plague. They're not in the bawdy stories. They're more sacred and honorable. Sacred and honorable love is associated with the aristocracy and is associated with sanitary abstinence. You'll notice, the stories themselves, there's all kinds of love and sex and bawdiness and so on, but it's all very above board and honorable when you remove yourself from the stories and get to the world of the storytellers. In most of the stories, profane love wins out. In most of the stories, profane love wins. In Day 5, Story 1, a character says, quote, "The constant love I have borne you gives me far more right to possess you than the plighted troth of Passamundus." That's on page 376. And so this constant love, his profane love, gives him more right to possess his beloved than the plighted troth or the honorable love of someone else. Sometimes characters find a way to balance sacred and profane love through satisfactory marriage. For example, in Day 5, Story 4. The theme of intellect, meaning ingenuity, craft, and wit. And so the book has a theme about the transformative power of intelligence. And so just to point out a few examples, which are numerous, let's see. Day 1, Story 1, if you want to look at it, it's page 34 in particular. And this is where, in the middle of page 34, that's who's saying this. The friar says to the main character, Sir Chappaletto, he says, "Sir Chappaletto, with God's help you will soon be well again. But in case it were to happen that God should summon your blessed and well-disposed soul to his presence, are you willing for your body to be buried in our convent?" And so on. The whole story, right, is the story of this wicked man, Sir Chappaletto, who, upon his deathbed, convinces people he's pious and so on and so forth. It's through his intellect that he does that, through his craftiness and wit. Let's see. Page 43 is part of the third story of Day 1. And let's see. So that's Day 1, Story 3. And let's see. This is the story of that guy. That one guy. Melchizedek, the Jew, with a story about 3 rings, avoids a most dangerous trap laid for him by Saladin. So he avoids this trap through his intellect by coming up with this clever story. In the fourth story, if you want to look at page 48, you'll see something similar. Look at the emphasis on intellect in the concluding paragraph of Day 1, Story 4 on page 48. The abbot, who was no fool, quickly realized that the monk had outwitted him, and moreover seen what he had done. Being tarred with the same brush, he was loath to inflict upon the monk a punishment of which he himself was no less deserving. So people outwitting other people, and so on and so forth, and getting by on their cleverness. Really interesting story in Day 5. The second story, and I'm looking at page 383 in particular, where Martuccio comes up with this plan for the king's archers to use fine strings, and so the arrows have a smaller, narrower notch in them to fit these finer strings, and so they can't be fired back by the enemy because the enemy is using thicker strings. And so this craftiness, this intellect, solves a problem for him. In terms of fortune, fortune is a capricious deity. And I think that was the case in the Golden Ass as well. There's a lot of discussion of fortune as this capricious deity, unpredictable, wishy-washy, not wishy-washy, but unpredictable, an unpredictable source of good and terrible luck, happy and unhappy coincidence. And there are lots of examples. Well, let me see here. For some reason, I was going to look at page 425. And so let me remember why that was. This is where fortune... Okay, so it's in the 9th story of day 5, page 425, where the narrator, in his little preface to the story, let's see, this is now, okay, Philomena is narrating, and she, before she tells the story, she says, this I have chosen not only to acquaint you with the power of your beauty over men of noble spirit, but so that you may learn to choose for yourselves, whenever necessary, the persons on whom to bestow your largesse, instead of always leaving these matters to be decided for you by fortune, who, as it happens, nearly always scatters her gifts with more abundance than discretion. So a little portrait of the capricious nature of fortune there. And why am I looking at page 430? Because there was something about fortune on page 430. And it is near the bottom of the page. My lady, he said, ever since God decreed that you should become the object of my love, I have repeatedly had cause to complain of fortune's hostility toward me. And you'll notice fortune is always capitalized, like the name of a deity. Let's see, what was I going to say here? And then the 7th story of day 5 is another example of the role of fortune. Let's see. At the very bottom of the page, at the end of a paragraph, consumed by the flames of love, they longed for one another with equal ardor, until fortune, as though deciding that they should be united, found a way for them to dispel the fears and apprehensions by which they were impeded. In both stories, well, which ones? In the story about day 5, story 2, and day 5, story 7, characters go from hell to heaven in a single bound. They leap out of hell and into heaven. Now in story 2, which is the one with the arrows, it's via intellect. Intellect lifts the main character out of hell and into heaven. In story 7, it's fortune that does the same thing. Okay, moving on. Here we go. And so here is a more detailed interpretation, well, a more specific interpretation by an individual scholar. And so I'm just going to summarize quickly for you this article by Pier Massimo Forni, Therapy and Prophylaxis in Boccaccio's Decameron. And he has his own particular interpretation of the entire book, which I think is kind of interesting. Prophylaxis, of course, means disease prevention. Disease prevention. You may have heard the word prophylactic as a noun before. And so this scholar, Forni, I believe this somewhat long quote I'm about to read to you summarizes his argument, and then I'll tell you some of the details of his argument, of his interpretation of the book. He says, quote, in his prologue, Boccaccio presents the Decameron as the result of a therapeutic project. The contents of the book will be beneficial to his audience, he states, in particular to that part of his audience consisting of lovesick women. His therapeutic strategy entails narrating the story of 10 young men and women who flee plague-ridden Florence to escape the grim consequences, both physical and moral, of the pestilence. These 10 young men and women, the so-called brigata, are thus engaged in a prophylactic project. Words are of paramount importance. The authorial therapeutic strategy is one of verbal intervention. Through the narration of stories, the author intends to better the lives of his lovesick readers. With the prophylactic strategy of the brigata, the storytellers, words are of exceptional importance as well. The narration of stories becomes the central activity of the youngsters' daily routine in the delightful countryside setting where they've taken shelter. So you see he's kind of pointing out there's 2 layers of prophylaxis in the Decameron. The Decameron itself is meant to be therapeutic, and it's about these 10 storytellers on a therapeutic project avoiding disease. Let's see. Let me see what else I want to read to you from this. He makes some interesting points about the depiction of society and how it is regulated by authority figures. So an interesting quote, Forney says, in the author's preface is the depiction of a society in which young women's lives are strictly regulated by figures of authority such as fathers, mothers, brothers, and husbands. This discipline may become intolerable when these young women are in love. So he's sort of sketching out the problem, or figuratively the disease, that women in society at the time were suffering from, this strict regulation of their lives. And he also points out the author will provide diversion. The stories will be exciting and will yield both pleasure and advice. At the core of the Decameron is a project of removal of affliction, of production of pleasure, which is outlined in the preface in rather general terms. Also, he says, the plague has also brought those women a freedom otherwise conceivable only in fantasies. They are no longer forced to follow the whims, fancies, and dictates of their fathers, mothers, brothers, and husbands. They are not forced to spend most of their time cooped up within the narrow confines of their rooms. And so, he says, the Decameron is a vision of freedom, of self-determination, of the conquest of open spaces beyond the boundaries of the domestic. By killing fathers, mothers, brothers, and husbands, the plague occasions the idyllic retreat of the brigata or storytellers, allowing the female readers to imagine an alternative world unencumbered by relentless figures of authority. A fantasy of parricide, murder of the father, informs the structural imagination of Boccaccio's Decameron. So good stuff, therapy and prophylaxis, and that has some bearing, as you heard in those quotes, on the role of women in society. Here's an interpretation of one of the days of the Decameron, so kind of narrowing the field a little bit. And so this is from an article called The Patriarch's Pleasure and the Frame-Tale Crisis by Michael Scherberg. And so again, I want to just kind of summarize and quote from this argument to give you an example of how one day of the Decameron could be interpreted in a scholarly fashion. And so in this article, the scholar Michael Scherberg points out that Philostrato, whose name, by the way, is pointed out in the introduction of the book, means defeated by love. More about theme of love there. But anyway, Philostrato, as the king of Day 4, chooses a controversial theme. And if you look at page 280, you'll refresh your memory on that. So Scherberg points out that, quote, by introducing an unhappy note, he challenges the very principles of the brigata's order. This order, it must be remembered, is female. The idea to escape Florence comes from Pampanea, who quickly emerges as the group's natural leader. The men are invited to join the ladies only because the ladies, doubt their ability to survive without men. Philostrato is the first king in the group after 3 queens, and the one who has suffered most at the hands of women. His decision reflects a desire to destroy women's pleasure. End quote. So there's 7 female storytellers and 3 men. Philostrato is the first king of one of the days. Some of the storytellers criticize Philostrato, quote, in their matriarchal order, the power to enforce male codes of pleasure has been dismantled, and in this context, Philostrato's rule becomes profoundly disquieting. But given their limited remedies, if they do not obey, their little society will collapse. The dissenters submit for now and await a restoration of equilibrium. What Philostrato has done then is usher in a violent return of the repressed male order. Now that's all in day 4. That's his day, Philostrato. So day 5 is seen as a remedy to the disruption of day 4 and the trauma of day 4. And so he says that day 5 is meant to be a remedy, but, quote, Philostrato's impact resurfaces primarily through the consistent representation of a dangerous patriarchal society in which the only hope for happiness lies in the male's ultimate benevolence, or short of that, in the female's passive submission to her fate. In these tales, the lover assumes the role of patriarch. Only the male is finally happy, for the female simply passes from one state of subjugation to another. So you've read day 5, and that's sort of an interpretation of the themes and major thrusts of day 5. He also says, quote, in the classic triangle, a male drawn into a female's sexual orbit threatens or obliterates the authority of another male, king, father, responsible brother, who is, however, finally beneficent. And he says that's in stories 2 through 7 that holds sway or something. And then he says, in its insidious revision, the lover either incorporates or is allied to the institutional power in opposition to female will, resorting thus to violence or coercion to reach his goal. And he says that applies in Tales 1, 8, and 9. It's day 5 that has this bizarre story of a man hunting a woman and so on and so forth. And so he talks about that story and he says, well, let's see. I'm summing up for now and I'll tell you when I start quoting. But Iphigenia submits to Simone. Nostagio gets his beloved to conform by showing her the weird man-hunting woman scene. Quote, the infernal hunter's message serves to underscore the impossibility of female autonomy. Sooner or later, men will have their revenge. The story thus exposes the fundamental coerciveness of courtly love, rather than extolling it. Nostagio's beloved understands this lesson at once. Fear turns her hate into an expedient love. So there's a little interpretation of that somewhat bizarre story. Actually, I've got 2 stories listed here, but I'm actually just going to talk about day 5, story 10. An article which has the title Positions and Presuppositions in the 10th Tale of the 5th Day of Boccaccio's The Decameron by Eugenio Bolongaro. And so just quickly, his argument is that the analysis of the general structure of plot development in Danao's tale sharpens our perception of Boccaccio's artistry and exposes some of the story's presuppositions as the mediating structure between text and context. Sorry, I said quickly. That's a bit abstract. And so I want to tell you some of the specifics of his argument. He divides the story, story 10 of day 5, into 3 parts. A neglected wife deceives her husband by taking a lover. The husband discovers the wife in the company of her lover. The husband and wife agree to share the lover. he compares those three parts of the story to, quote, the three movements in a dialectical model: the thesis, the wife's natural right to obtain sexual gratification from her husband. That thesis is contained in the wife's monologue at the beginning of part 1 and is amplified by the old woman's speech. The antithesis, the wife's moral duty to be sexually faithful to her husband, no matter what, that antithesis is contained in Pietro's tale, and particularly in the wife's evaluation of Pietro's tale. And the synthesis, which is the uninhibited reconciliation of reciprocal rights and duties, that synthesis is the mutually satisfying sharing arrangement reached by Pietro and his wife. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Let's move on. And this slide is shifting gears. I wanted to talk about constructing an interpretation. I hope you guys have looked at the 3 assignments I posted information about. I emailed you about that. And so you have, well, it's 4 assignments, isn't it? Presentation, 2 short papers, and a term paper. And if I remember correctly, I know the term paper and I think also the second short paper require you to do some interpreting of a work of literature, of one of our works of literature. And so I wanted to tell you about how I would go about constructing an interpretation, or how I have. Essentially, I've done some pre-writing for an interpretation of one of the characters in one of the stories, and gosh, I forget which story that is. I'm going to have to pause this and look that up for you. Hold on. Okay, sorry, Primus is a character in the 7th story of Day 1. This is the story of Primus, yeah. And pausing, hold on a second. Okay, so Primus is a scholar. He's a character in a story that a character named Bergamino tells to make a point. Another example of intellect coming to the fore. And so this is a very much embedded story, right? It's a story within a story within a story, or something along those lines. But my theory, having read about how, their society was in a transition when the Decameron was written between medieval and Renaissance culture, my theory is that Primus represents this new middle class, this new Renaissance class of man, the artist/scholar. And I talked previously in the last PowerPoint about that class arising and gaining strength and so on. Primus is poor, but he's a skilled, well-known grammarian and scholar and so on. And the story is, the main feature of the story that interests me is how the abbot reacts to Primus. Primus is seated in the dining hall where he's come for a free meal, and he's the first guy that the abbot sees when he walks through the door, and he just has this immediate reaction of sort of repulsion, and he decides not to feed this guy. And then he finds out that Primus has brought his own bread and is eating it, and that angers him. But then the abbot sort of changes his tune, and he's on page 58. He said to himself, "Now what on earth has gotten into me today? Why have I suddenly become such a miser? Why should I feel so much contempt for this unknown visitor?" And so on. Which to me, he's showing confusion when he's confronted with this man that he can't make sense of. And I think it's because he's a Renaissance man, and the abbot associated with church hierarchy and so on is more of a medieval person. He changes his mind, but his immediate reaction is bafflement and confusion and even shame. If you look further on page 58, you'll see him talking about being ashamed of himself. And so the quote, so if I were going to write an article about Primus, I would need a thesis, and I've stated it there for you on the slide. I would need to begin by giving some context, And now I remember that I'm relating this really to the term paper, your term paper assignment, where you kind of use cultural context and literary interpretation and blend them in a term paper. And so the cultural context would have to do with these 3 medieval classes and the 2 new Renaissance classes that I've talked about. Summarizing the story would provide context, reminding even someone who's familiar with the Decameron of the nature of the story and who Primus is and so on. And then I would have some supporting ideas, some points that I would want to make in support of my thesis. I would want to first establish that in the story Primus is identified as a scholar, and I would give some textual evidence. I would quote from the story to show that he's identified as a scholar. I would want to establish that Primus is impoverished, but he has prestige, and I would offer evidence from the text. I would want to establish that the abbot, on the other hand, is a member of the dominant cultural institution of the Middle Ages, the Church, and textual evidence could easily support that, quotes from the story. And then I would want to characterize the abbot's reaction, as I've just done, as confused and baffled, and that's uncharacteristic of him because he's on unfamiliar ground. And again, I could use textual evidence to support that point. And so that's just kind of a quick sketch of, if you have an interpretation of a character or of a story or of an aspect of a piece of literature, you can bring together your thesis, the context, both cultural context and the story context, and some supporting ideas, back it up with textual evidence, and you've got, if not 5 to 10 pages, maybe more. And so that's just kind of hopefully helpful as you're planning a term paper. Let's